No one could fix the truck until an unemployed mechanic showed up and fixed it as if it were nothing. The midday sun beat down relentlessly on Los Hernandez auto repair shop on the outskirts of Guadalajara. The air smelled of burnt oil and hot metal, while five mechanics surrounded a heavy-duty Kenworth truck that had been stuck in the same spot for 3 weeks. It was a worn-out red steel monster, its tires covered in road dust and its engine exposed like a patient in surgery that no one knew how to save. Roberto Hernandez, owner of the shop and heir to 3 generations of mechanics, wiped the sweat from his forehead with a greasy rag. At 52, he had never faced a problem he couldn't solve until now. The truck belonged to Transporte Morales, a family business that had been moving goods between Guadalajara and the border for decades. Don Arturo Morales, the owner, had been clear. Without that truck running, they would lose important contracts and probably have to lay off employees. "Boss, we've checked everything again," said Miguel, the youngest mechanic on the team, with obvious frustration in his voice. "The computer isn't showing any errors, but the engine just won't start. It's as if it has no soul." Roberto shook his head. They had replaced the injection system, checked every sensor, changed the fuel pump, analyzed the entire electrical system, but nothing worked. The engine remained silent, a sleeping giant that refused to wake up. They had already spent more than $40,000 on spare parts, and Don Arturo called every day asking about progress that didn't exist. "Maybe we should call the Kenworth dealer in the city," suggested Fernando, the workshop's second in command. "This is beyond us." "And pay them triple what we charge," Roberto replied bitterly. "Don Arturo trusted us. I can't just give up and tell him to call someone else. My grandfather founded this workshop precisely so that working people wouldn't have to pay fortunes to dealerships." The workshop phone rang. It was Don Arturo again. Roberto took a deep breath before answering. "Don Arturo, good morning." "Roberto, I need to know if there's good news today. I just lost another contract. If the truck isn't ready by Monday, I'm going to have to take the case to my lawyer and see what we can do." Roberto felt a knot in his stomach. It wasn't a direct threat, but the message was clear. They were on the verge of a lawsuit that could sink the workshop. "Don Arturo, I promise you we'll work it out. Give me until Friday. It's Wednesday, Roberto. You have 2 days. I'm sorry, but my business is also at stake." When he hung up, Roberto looked at his team. They all had the same look of defeat on their faces. The workshop's reputation, built up over 60 years, was about to crumble because of an engine that refused to cooperate. "Everyone go home," said Roberto. "Finally, tomorrow we'll start early and go over everything from scratch. There must be something we're overlooking." The mechanics began to put away their tools in silence. The atmosphere was mournful. As they cleaned up, Roberto stood next to the truck with his hands in his pockets, staring at the engine as if he expected it to reveal its secrets to him telepathically. Outside, the traffic on the main avenue created its usual urban symphony. Trucks, buses, the cries of street vendors. Guadalajara didn't stop for anyone, and Roberto felt that he couldn't afford to either. "Excuse me." The voice came from the entrance to the workshop. Roberto looked up and saw a man in his 40s, thin but as strong, wearing a worn denim shirt and work boots that had seen better days. His face was weathered by the sun, and his hands were calloused from a lifetime of hard work. He carried an old backpack over his shoulder. "We're closed," Roberto said without much enthusiasm. "I know, but I saw the truck from outside," the man replied, pointing to the Kenworth. "It's been there for weeks, right? I've seen you working on it since it came in." "And?" Roberto asked, unable to hide his irritation. The last thing he needed was a nosy guy asking questions. "I'm a mechanic. Well, I was. I lost my job 4 months ago when they closed the shop where I worked in Tlaquepaque. I've been looking for work ever since," he said, pausing as if embarrassed to admit his situation. "I haven't had any luck." "My name is Javier Ruiz." Roberto studied him skeptically. The man seemed honest, but also desperate, and Roberto had learned that desperation sometimes made people exaggerate their abilities. "Look, buddy, I appreciate you coming by, but I have the best mechanics in the area and we haven't been able to figure this out. I'm not hiring right now." Javier nodded but didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the truck's exposed engine. "Can I take a look?" "Just a minute. I won't charge you anything. If I can't help, I'll leave and won't bother you again. There was something in the way he said it, a mixture of humility and confidence that made Roberto hesitate. He glanced at his watch. It was almost 6 p.m. and his team had already left. What did he have to lose? All right, 1 minute. Javier put his backpack on the ground and approached the truck with determined but respectful steps, like someone entering a temple. He stood motionless in front of the engine for several seconds, simply observing. Then he leaned over, bringing his ear close to different parts of the injection system. Do you have a flashlight? He asked. Roberto handed him one. Javier illuminated specific areas of the engine, carefully moving cables and feeling connections. His movements were methodical, as if he were reading a book written in a language only he understood. Did you try to start the engine with the accelerator fully depressed? Javier asked without taking his eyes off the engine. Of course, that was the first thing we did. And they checked the EGR valve 3 times. It's clean. Javier continued his inspection in silence. Roberto was beginning to get impatient when the man finally spoke. I think I know what it is. Roberto crossed his arms and looked at Javier with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. In 30 years working in the family workshop, he had seen dozens of cocky mechanics who thought they could solve in minutes what took others days. Most ended up making things worse. Oh, really? And what is it that 5 experienced mechanics couldn't see? Roberto asked, not hiding the sarcasm in his voice. Javier wiped his hands on his pants before answering. He didn't seem offended by Roberto's tone. Rather, he seemed accustomed to that kind of reception. The crankshaft position sensor is working, but it's sending incorrect information to the computer. It's not completely damaged. That's why the computer doesn't show an error. It's intermittent, and when you try to start it, the engine timing slips at just the critical moment. Roberto frowned. They had checked that sensor, but Javier was right about one thing. If the sensor was partially working, the computer wouldn't necessarily detect a complete failure. We already replaced that sensor. We put in a new one 2 weeks ago. What brand? Javier asked. A quality generic. They cost half as much as the originals. Javier nodded slowly, as if that confirmed his suspicions. There's the problem. Generic sensors for this 2018 Kenworth model have a different tolerance. It's not that they're poorly made, they're just not calibrated. Exactly like the originals. For a normal engine, it wouldn't be a problem. But this truck has over 400,000 kilometers. The computer is so finely tuned that even a slight variation in the sensor signal confuses it. Roberto felt a pang of hope mixed with embarrassment. If Javier was right, they had spent weeks and thousands of pesos chasing non-existent problems, when the solution was right under their noses. If it's that simple, why didn't anyone else notice? Because it's not simple, Javier replied with a half-smile. I had an almost identical case 3 years ago in Monterrey, a Freightliner trailer that no one could start. It took me 2 weeks to figure it out. Since then, I always check the exact compatibility of replacement parts, especially in engines with high mileage. Roberto walked around the truck processing the information. Everything in him wanted to believe Javier, but years of experience had taught him to be cautious. Okay, let's assume you're right. The original sensor will cost about $300 and take 2 days to arrive from the distributor. I don't have that kind of time. Don Arturo needs the truck by Monday. Is there another way, Javier said, approaching the engine again? I can recalibrate the generic sensor. It's a delicate process, but I've done it successfully before. I would need access to a computer with the right diagnostic software and about 4 hours of uninterrupted work. 4 hours. Roberto looked at his watch. It was already 6:30 in the evening. It would be midnight by the time you finished. I don't mind working at night. I've worked in worse conditions. Roberto studied Javier's face. There was determination there, but also something else, need. This man needed to prove his worth as much as Roberto needed to save his reputation and his workshop. How much do you charge? Javier looked down for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the question. Look, Don Roberto, I know this sounds desperate, but I haven't had a job in months. My wife Anna is working double shifts as a nurse at the civil hospital to keep us afloat. We have accumulated rent debts. If I manage to fix the truck, do you think you could consider me for a job here? I don't need a big salary at first, just a chance. Roberto felt a weight on his chest. He recognized that look. He had seen it in the mirror during the first few years after inheriting his father's workshop. when every job was a battle to keep the business afloat. I'll be honest with you, Javier, I don't have the budget to hire anyone right now. Business has been slow, and this truck has cost us more than we're going to make on it. But he paused, making a decision he knew was risky. If you can get that engine started tonight, I'll pay you 2,000 pesos for today's work and hire you on a project basis. When there's extra work, I'll call you. That's all I can offer right now. Javier's eyes lit up. It wasn't much, but it was something, and the promise of future work was worth more than the immediate money. Deal, he said, extending his hand, and Roberto shook it. But there's one more condition, Roberto added. If it doesn't work, I won't blame you, and I'll pay you 500 pesos for your time. But I don't want you to touch anything else in the engine without consulting one. I can't risk you making things worse, understood? Just the sensor. If it doesn't work, I'll stop there. Roberto went to his office and returned with the workshop keys and a thermos of coffee. I'm going to stay with you. I want to see how you work. And besides, someone has to learn in case we face this again. Javier nodded gratefully and began to work. The first thing he did was to completely disconnect the sensor's electrical system and connect it to the workshop's diagnostic computer. Roberto watched his every move, taking mental notes. The problem with generic sensors, Javier explained as he worked, is that they're designed to work on a wide range of engines, but each engine has its own particularities. This Kenworth has been used on mountain routes, right? Yes. Don Arturo drives routes to Tijuana and Monterey, lots of uphill and downhill. That explains the specific wear and tear on the engine. The computer has been adjusting to that wear and tear for years. When you put in a new sensor with factory settings, it's like speaking to it in a different dialect of the same language. It understands, but not perfectly. For the next 2 hours, Javier worked with absolute concentration. He used a multimeter to measure microscopic resistances, adjusted values on the computer, and occasionally paused simply to observe the engine, as if he were having a silent conversation with it. Roberto made more coffee and ordered tacos from a nearby stand. They ate quickly, almost silently, focused on the work. As they ate, Roberto couldn't help but ask, "Where did you learn all this? It's not knowledge that's taught in any course." Javier wiped the sauce from his fingers before answering. "My father was a diesel mechanic. He worked for 40 years at a transportation company in Mexico City. He took me to the workshop since I was a child. By the time I was 16, I could already take apart an entire engine. Later, I studied automotive mechanics at Conalep. But what really taught me was working alongside older mechanics, the ones who learned before computers existed. They knew how to listen to engines. They said that every engine has its own voice." "And what brought you to Guadalajara?" "Love, like many stories," he smiled nostalgically. "I met Ana in a first aid course in Mexico City. She's from here, from Guadalajara. When we got married, we decided to move because her family is here and she got a job at the hospital. I found a job at a workshop in Tlaquepaque. I worked there for 8 years. It was a good place, but the owner got sick with diabetes. He had complications and decided to close. Since then, I've knocked on doors at every workshop in the area. And why haven't they hired you? You clearly know what you're doing." Javier sighed deeply before answering. "Most workshops want young mechanics who charge little or mechanics with their own clients who bring in work. I'm 43 years old. I'm not as young as I used to be, and all my contacts are in Mexico City. Some told me I'm overqualified. Others are simply not hiring. It's a vicious circle. You need about to have contacts, but you need contacts to get a job." Roberto nodded silently. He knew that reality well. The auto repair business was more complicated than people thought. It wasn't enough to be a good mechanic. You needed a reputation, contacts, and often luck. After midnight, Javier finally sat up and stretched his back. "Okay, let's try to start it." Roberto felt his heart race, approached the truck, and turned the ignition key. The engine turned once, twice, and on the third try, it roared to life with a deep, steady sound that filled the shop like symphonic music. The roar of the Kenworth engine filled the shop with a power Roberto hadn't heard in 3 weeks. It was a beautiful, deep, steady sound without the irregularities that had characterized the previous failed attempts. Roberto stood motionless for several seconds, almost unable to believe what his ears were telling him. The engine was running perfectly. Javier kept his hand on the accelerator, monitoring the dashboard gauges with professional attention. After 5 minutes of observation, he gradually reduced the revs until the engine was idling. The sound stabilized into a steady, healthy purr. "Check the gauges," Javier said, pointing to the panel. "Normal temperature, optimal oil pressure, synchronized injection. Everything is working as it should." Roberto approached the dashboard, checking each reading. It was as if the truck had never had any problems. He felt a wave of conflicting emotions, immense relief at having solved the problem, gratitude towards this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere, but also professional embarrassment at not having identified the problem sooner. "It's incredible," Roberto muttered, almost to himself. 3 weeks, 5 mechanics, thousands of pesos in spare parts, and the solution was to recalibrate a sensor. "Don't feel bad," Javier replied as he turned off the engine. "These types of problems are the most difficult to diagnose precisely because they are not obvious. An engine that won't start due to a lack of fuel or a completely damaged sensor are easy to identify. But a component that malfunctions only under specific conditions requires experience with similar cases or a lot of luck." Roberto leaned against the wall of the workshop, feeling the exhaustion of the last few weeks fall on him like a physical weight. He looked at his watch. It was 1 a.m. Outside, Guadalajara slept, and the silence of the night made the workshop seem like a refuge isolated from the world. "Let me start the engine one more time, just to be sure," Roberto said. He needed to confirm it with his own hands. He turned the key, and again the engine responded immediately. He let it run for 10 minutes, listening to every note of its mechanical symphony, looking for any irregularities. He found none. Javier finally said, "You just saved my workshop. If this hadn't worked, Don Arturo would probably have sued me, and even if I had won the case, my reputation would have been destroyed. In this business, reputation is everything." Javier smiled shyly, carefully putting away his tools. "I just did my job. Well, the job I would have liked to be doing these last 4 months." Roberto took out his wallet and counted out 2,500 pesos in cash. "We said 2,000, but you deserve more. Here's 2,500. Javier took the money with trembling hands. Roberto could see the emotion in his eyes, that mixture of pride and relief that comes when talent is finally recognized and rewarded. "Thank you, Don Roberto. This means a lot. My wife and I have been struggling for months. We can pay the rent we owe, and about the job," Roberto continued. "What I told you is serious. When there are special projects or we're swamped, I'll call you. Leave me your number." They exchanged contact information. Javier tucked the piece of paper with Roberto's number away, as if it were a priceless treasure. Roberto made a decision. "What are you doing tomorrow afternoon?" "Nothing tomorrow. I was going to keep looking for work." "Come by at 2. I want my team to meet you and for you to explain what you did. They need to see this. And by the way, there's a Chevrolet Silverado that's giving us trouble with the transmission system. Nothing urgent, but if you want to check it out," Javier's eyes lit up. "Seriously, sure, I'll be here." They said goodbye with a firm handshake, the kind of greeting that seals important deals. After Javier left, Roberto stayed in the workshop for almost an hour, just looking at the Kenworth, processing everything that had happened. The next morning, Roberto arrived at the workshop at 7 a.m., 2 hours earlier than usual. He hadn't slept much, but the excitement was stronger than the fatigue. The first thing he did was start the Kenworth again. The engine responded perfectly, dispelling any lingering doubts. When his team began to arrive, the reaction was one of utter disbelief. "Boss, is the truck running?" Miguel asked, approaching cautiously, as if afraid it were an illusion. "What? Sit down, everyone," Roberto said, pointing to the chairs in the break area. "We need to talk." He gathered his 5 mechanics and told them the whole story. Javier's appearance, his diagnosis, the hours of night work, and finally the success. As he spoke, he could see a variety of reactions on the faces of his team. Relief, curiosity, and in some, a touch of wounded pride. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad," Roberto clarified. "We all did our best, but there is an important lesson here. There is always something new to learn, no matter how much experience we have." Javier was unemployed for 4 months, not because he's a bad mechanic, but because the market is unfair sometimes. Talent isn't always recognized immediately. Fernando, the second in command, spoke carefully. "Are you going to hire him permanently?" "I can't afford it right now," Roberto replied honestly. but he's coming in this afternoon. I want you to meet him and see how he works. And when we have projects that require his specific expertise, I'll call him." Miguel, the youngest of the group, seemed genuinely excited. "I'd like to learn what he did, recalibrating sensors for worn-out engines. They never taught me that in school, and that's why he's coming." Roberto smiled. "We're all going to learn something new." At 10 a.m., Roberto called Don Arturo with the best news in weeks. "Don Arturo, the truck is ready." There was a silence on the other end of the line, followed by a deep sigh. "Seriously, Roberto, you're not giving me false hope. Come see for yourself. The engine is running perfectly. You can take it whenever you want." An hour later, Don Arturo arrived at the workshop in his pickup truck, accompanied by his eldest son, Marco, who drove most of his routes. Both looked skeptical but hopeful. Roberto led them to the Kenworth. Marcos climbed into the cab and turned the key. The engine roared to life immediately, and Marco's expression changed from skepticism to amazement. "Dad, listen, this sounds better than it has in months." Don Arturo, a 60-year-old man with completely white hair and hands weathered by decades of work, slowly walked around the truck, listening. Finally, he stopped in front of Roberto with tears in his eyes. "Roberto, I thought we were going to have to sell this truck for parts. It's the first truck I bought when I started my business 25 years ago. It has sentimental value. I know, Don Arturo, and I'm sorry it took so long, but it's ready and it's going to run well. How much do I owe you?" With all the time and parts, Roberto had done the calculations that morning. Between parts, labor, and Javier's pay, the total costs were considerable. But he also knew that Don Arturo had been going through financial difficulties. The original estimate we agreed on was 30,000 pesos. "With the additional parts and extra work, I should charge you 45,000, but I know it's been a difficult month for your business. Let's settle for 35,000 and we'll call it even." Don Arturo extended his hand, and Roberto shook it firmly. "You're a fair man, Roberto. Your father would be proud. And the next time someone asks me for a good repair shop, Los Hernandez will be the first one I recommend." After Don Arturo drove away in his truck, Roberto felt a huge weight lift off his shoulders. The repair shop was safe, his reputation was intact, but more importantly, he had learned something valuable about not underestimating people based solely on their current situation. At 2 p.m. sharp, Javier arrived at the shop wearing clean but worn clothes. A denim shirt with slightly frayed elbows and the same work pants he had worn the day before. Washed, but with grease stains that no detergent could completely remove. He carried his old backpack over his shoulder and wore an expression that mixed hope and nervousness. Roberto greeted him at the entrance and led him to the break area where his team was finishing lunch. The smell of ham sandwiches and coffee filled the space. 5 pairs of eyes turned to study the newcomer, with curiosity mixed with some suspicion. "Guys, this is Javier Ruiz, the mechanic I mentioned this morning. Javier, this is Miguel, Fernando, Carlos, Luis, and Santiago." The greetings were cordial but measured. Roberto could sense the underlying tension. It was natural. No one enjoyed knowing that a stranger had solved in hours what they had been unable to solve in weeks. "Look," Roberto said, breaking the uncomfortable silence, "I know this may seem strange, but we're all in the same boat. We're mechanics, and our job is to solve problems. Sometimes a fresh perspective is exactly what's needed. Javier has experience in areas where we can learn something new, so I asked him to explain what he did last night." Javier cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. "First of all, I don't want you to think I'm here to show off or make you look bad. You did everything correctly according to the manual. The problem was that this specific case required going beyond the manual." For the next 30 minutes, Javier explained his diagnosis in technical but accessible detail. He used the workshop whiteboard to draw diagrams of the sensor system, showed the multimeter readings he had taken, and explained why generic sensors could cause problems in high-mileage engines. Miguel, the youngest, frantically took notes on his phone. Fernando asked specific questions about tolerances and calibration. Even Carlos, the most veteran and typically the most skeptical of the group, seemed genuinely interested. "And does this apply only to Kenworth or also to other brands?" Fernando asked. "Most modern diesel engines have similar systems: Freightliner, International, Volvo. They can all experience this type of incompatibility with generic replacement parts. The key is to understand that an engine with high mileage is not the same as when it left the factory. It has adapted to its specific wear and tear. Where did you learn that? Carlos asked directly, with the tone of someone who was still not completely convinced. Hard school, Javier replied with a wry smile. I made this same mistake years ago with a Freightliner. I replaced the sensor 3 times before I realized that the problem wasn't the sensor itself, but its compatibility with the specific wear and tear of the engine. It cost me a week's work and the customer's patience. I never forgot it. Carlos nodded slowly. Everyone in the workshop had had their own expensive lessons, those mistakes that marked you and made you a better mechanic. Okay, Roberto said after the explanation. Now let's move on to something practical. Javier, I mentioned last night that we have a 2020 Chevrolet Silverado with transmission problems. Would you like to take a look at it? I'd love to. The Silverado in question was white with red accents. It belonged to a local accountant who used it to travel between Guadalajara and nearby towns. The reported problem was that the automatic transmission occasionally got stuck in second gear, especially on long climbs. Roberto and his team had already checked the vehicle for 2 days, changed the transmission fluid, checked the solenoids, and verified the electronic sensors. Everything seemed to be working properly in the workshop, but the customer insisted that the problem persisted on the road. It's one of those frustrating cases, Roberto explained, as they walked toward the truck. Here in the shop it works perfectly, but the customer says that on the road, especially on the climb to Texas stand, it gets stuck in second gear. Javier crouched down and looked under the truck. Then he opened the hood and studied the engine compartment for several minutes in silence. The mechanics in the shop watched, some with their arms crossed, waiting to see what this stranger could find that they had overlooked. Can I take it for a test drive? Javier finally asked. Roberto hesitated. The shop's insurance policies were clear about who could drive customer vehicles. I'll drive, you ride shotgun, and tell me what to look for. Perfect. They got into the Silverado and Roberto drove to Lopez Mateos Avenue. Then he took the road that climbs up to Tezistan. It was a 20-kilometer route with several steep inclines, perfect for testing transmissions under stress. For the first 10 minutes, the truck ran perfectly. Roberto accelerated, shifted gears. Everything responded as it should. He was beginning to think that perhaps the problem was intermittent or even imaginary when Javier spoke up. Stop at that lookout, he said, pointing to a rest area next to the highway. Roberto parked and Javier immediately got out and headed to the back of the truck. He crouched down under the vehicle again, this time running his hand along the transmission lines. Touch here, Javier said, pointing to a specific section of the pipe connecting the transmission cooler. Feel that? Roberto placed his hand where Javier indicated. The pipe was unusually hot, much more than it should be after only 20 minutes of driving. The transmission cooler is partially clogged, Javier explained. Not completely, that's why it works fine on short trips and in the shop. But on long climbs, when the transmission generates more heat, the fluid overheats. The computer detects the high temperature and locks the transmission in second gear as a protective measure. We checked the cooler 2 days ago, said Roberto, feeling both impressed and irritated with himself. Did they check it with pressure or just visually? Roberto paused. They had visually checked for leaks and that the fluid was circulating, but they had not done a full pressure test to check the internal flow. Visually only, he admitted, it's an easy mistake to make. It looks fine from the outside, but inside it can have sediment buildup that restricts flow. This is especially common in Guadalajara because of the hot climate and heavy traffic. Vehicles spend a lot of time idling with hot engines. They returned to the workshop in silence. Roberto mentally processed everything he had observed. This man not only had technical knowledge, he had intuition developed through years of varied experience. Back in the workshop, Javier demonstrated his diagnosis, disconnected the transmission cooler, and performed a flow test with compressed air. The air passed through, but noticeably slower than it should have. When they opened it completely, they found a significant buildup of sediment in the internal ducts. You're going to have to replace the cooler or give it a deep cleaning with the specialized products, Javier explained. Cleaning is cheaper, but it takes time. Replacement is faster, but more expensive. Fernando, who had been watching the whole process, finally spoke with genuine respect in his voice. How did you know it was the cooler without even testing first, experience, and patterns? Javier replied, Wow, I've seen this specific problem in GM trucks in hot weather at least 5 times. It always has the same presentation. It works fine on short distances, fails on long climbs. All the major components are fine when you test them individually. Once you recognize the pattern, you know where to look. Miguel approached with his phone in hand. Do you mind if I add you to a WhatsApp group we have with mechanics from all over the city? We share difficult cases and solutions. I think you could contribute a lot. Javier seemed genuinely touched by the invitation. I'd love to, thank you. The rest of the afternoon was spent with Javier sharing other experiences and unconventional solutions he had encountered throughout his career. The atmosphere in the workshop gradually changed from suspicion to camaraderie. The mechanics began to ask him questions about their own difficult cases, and Javier responded not with an air of superiority, but with the humility of someone who knows there is always more to learn. When the clock struck 6 p.m., Roberto gathered everyone together again. Javier, I can't officially pay you any more for today, but I want you to know that you have a place here whenever you need it. You already have my number, and he turned his attention to the rest of the team. I hope you've learned what I've learned. The best mechanic isn't the one who knows everything, but the one who is willing to keep learning. As Javier prepared to leave, Carlos, the skeptical veteran, approached him and offered his hand. Good job today. And hey, if you ever need someone to back you up to get a job somewhere else, give me your number. I know several shop owners. Javier shook his hand with obvious gratitude. Thanks, bro, really. After Javier left, Roberto stayed in his office reviewing accounts. The numbers for the month were still tight, but at least the disaster with the Kenworth had been averted. More importantly, he had found a valuable resource in Javier, someone he could turn to for specialized cases. His phone rang. It was an unknown number. Los Hernandez Workshop. This is Don Roberto speaking. Mauricio Gomez from Transportes del Pacifico. Don Arturo Morales gave me your number. He says you solved a problem with his Kenworth that no one else could. I have 3 trailers that need urgent service. Do you have the capacity? Roberto smiled. Reputation worked fast in the world of transporters. Of course, Mr. Mauricio. When do you need us to check them? As he wrote down the details, Roberto thought of Javier. 3 trailers meant a lot of work, possibly more than his regular team could comfortably handle. He was going to need help. After hanging up with Mr. Mauricio, Roberto dialed Javier's number. Javier, it's Roberto. How busy are you for the rest of the week? The sun was just beginning to rise over the hills surrounding Guadalajara. When Javier arrived at the Los Hernandez workshop that Friday morning, he brought a thermos of homemade coffee and a bag of tamales that his wife Anna had prepared the night before, insisting that he share some with his new coworkers. Although he wasn't technically a permanent employee, Roberto's call the day before had meant more than words could express. 3 Transportes del Pacifico trailers required urgent service before the weekend and needed all available mechanics. Roberto was already at the workshop when Javier arrived, reviewing work orders and organizing the space to receive the 3 massive vehicles that would arrive in the next few hours. Good morning, Javier. You're early. I couldn't sleep, Javier admitted with a smile. It's been months since I've had a full work week ahead of me. My wife almost cried when I told her last night, not just because of the money, but because feeling that my work has value again means so much. Roberto placed a hand on Javier's shoulder. He understood that feeling perfectly. Work wasn't just a source of income. It was dignity, purpose, identity. We're going to be swamped today, Roberto explained as they reviewed the work orders together. 2 of the trailers need routine but extensive maintenance, oil changes, filters, and a complete overhaul of the brakes and electrical systems. The 3rd has a more serious problem with the power steering system. The owner, Mr. Mauricio, says the steering wheel gets stiff when turning, especially after the engine warms up. Have you checked the hydraulic fluid level? Don Mauricio says it's full, but he wants a complete evaluation. He can't risk an accident with that trailer on the road. At 7 o'clock sharp, the entire Los Hernandez team was assembled, and shortly thereafter, the 3 enormous trailers arrived, 2 Freightliner Cascadias and 1 Volvo VNL. They were impressive machines, each representing an investment of several million pesos and the livelihood of entire families who depended on those vehicles to function perfectly. Roberto distributed the tasks. Fernando and Miguel would take one of the freight liners. Carlos and Luis would work on the other. Meanwhile, Roberto, Santiago, and Javier would take care of the Volvo with the steering problem. The first four mechanics immediately set to work on routine maintenance. There was an almost choreographed efficiency in their movements. Years of working together had given them a synchronized rhythm. Meanwhile, Javier approached the Volvo with Roberto and Santiago. "Let me start it up first and see how the steering responds," Javier said. He climbed into the cab of the massive truck. From that height, he could see the entire workshop spread out below him. He started the engine and let it warm up for a few minutes while he watched the gauges. Then, with the vehicle still parked, he began turning the steering wheel from left to right, feeling the resistance. "The steering is a little heavy even now, but still manageable," he reported from the cab. "Let me move it around a bit in the yard." With Roberto acting as his guide, Javier maneuvered the trailer around the spacious workshop yard, making tight turns and testing the steering response. After 10 minutes, he returned to park with a frown. "It definitely gets harder when the engine warms up, but there's something strange. It doesn't feel like a fluid leak or a faulty pump. It's more intermittent." Santiago, who had worked at the shop almost as long as Roberto, suggested checking the hoses and connections first. Over the next hour, the three men meticulously inspected every component of the power steering system. The fluid levels were correct, there were no visible leaks, and the hoses were in good condition. "This reminds me of a case I had years ago," Javier said, as he wiped his hands with a rag, "a construction truck with similar symptoms. The problem wasn't with the hydraulic system itself, but with the pump mounting bracket." "The bracket?" Santiago asked skeptically. "How could that affect the steering? If the bracket is cracked or slightly loose, it allows the pump to move microscopically when the engine heats up and the parts expand. That minimal movement misaligns the pump relative to the drive belt, reducing its efficiency." Roberto and Santiago exchanged glances. It was an unconventional theory, but it made sense. "Let's check the bracket then," Roberto decided. Sure enough, after a detailed inspection with a magnifying glass, Javier found a fine crack in the aluminum bracket of the steering pump. It was almost invisible to the naked eye, but under magnification it was clearly visible. "Here's the culprit," Javier pointed out. "When the engine heats up, the metal expands and the crack opens slightly. The pump moves, the belt doesn't drive it as efficiently, and the steering becomes heavy." "I would never have thought to look for that," Santiago admitted honestly. "I would have kept looking at the hoses and the pump itself. I only knew because I made the mistake of not looking for it the first time." Javier smiled. "I replaced the entire pump on that construction truck. It cost a fortune, and the problem persisted. It was the oldest mechanic in the shop who pointed out the bracket to me. I never forgot that. They ordered the replacement bracket, which would arrive in 2 hours. And while they waited, Javier helped the other teams with their respective tasks. He moved from one vehicle to another, offering suggestions, sharing techniques, and most importantly, learning from each mechanic as well. Miguel showed him an efficient method for bleeding air brake systems in the trailers. Carlos shared a trick for identifying electrical problems using only a multimeter and common sense. There was a positive energy in the shop that day, a sense of shared purpose. Around 2 p.m., with everyone working hard, Roberto called for a lunch break. Javier shared the tamales Ana had sent, and the team contributed soft drinks and tortillas from a nearby stand. They sat in the break area, sweaty but satisfied, sharing not only food but stories. "Do you know what's the hardest thing about being unemployed?" Javier said between bites. "It's not just the money, although that obviously weighs heavily. It's feeling like your experience is worthless. You spend years perfecting your craft, accumulating knowledge, and suddenly no one wants to hire you. You start to doubt yourself." "What was the hardest moment?" Miguel asked with genuine curiosity. Javier looked down at his tamale, gathering his thoughts before answering. 2 months ago, my wife had a medical emergency, nothing serious in the end, but we had to go to the hospital. When we got to the cashier to pay, I realized I didn't have enough money. Anna had to call her sister to borrow some. There I was, a 43-year-old man, a mechanic, experienced, and I couldn't even cover my own wife's medical emergency. That was the lowest point. The silence in the group was heavy, but empathetic. Everyone had had their own moments of difficulty. Even so, I didn't risk coming here that day, Javier continued. I saw the truck from the street for weeks. I knew there was a problem they weren't able to solve. I thought, maybe this is my chance. My wife told me I was crazy, that they would probably fire me, but something told me to try. I'm glad you did, Roberto said sincerely. And I want to talk about it. These 3 trailers are going to make us a good profit. The pay for this week will be 4,000 pesos, and depending on how things go, I want to offer you something more permanent. Javier looked up abruptly. Seriously, I can't promise you a fixed salary yet. The workshop's numbers don't allow it, but I can offer you a mixed scheme, 2 fixed days a week here with guaranteed pay. More work per project when there are special cases. I also want you to give a monthly workshop to the team sharing advanced techniques. I would pay you for those sessions separately. Javier's hands trembled slightly as he extended his hand to Roberto. I accept and thank you, not only for the but for the opportunity to feel useful again. The rest of the team applauded a simple but meaningful gesture of acceptance. Fernando raised his soda in an impromptu toast, or for new beginnings and for remembering that we all deserve second chances. The afternoon continued with renewed energy. The replacement bracket for the Volvo arrived at 4 p.m., and Javier installed it with precision and care. When they tested the steering again, the problem had completely disappeared. The steering wheel turned smoothly, even with the engine at operating temperature. By 7 p.m., the 3 trailers were complete and ready to return to the road. Don Mauricio arrived in person to pick them up, accompanied by 2 of his drivers. Don Roberto, they told me he found the steering problem. What was it? A cracked mounting bracket, Roberto explained. Very difficult to detect, but my mechanic Javier identified it. If we hadn't found it, it would have eventually caused a complete pump failure, possibly on the road. Javier, Don Mauricio turned to where Javier was cleaning his tools. Are you new here? Relatively, yes, sir. Good work. That trailer runs routes to Tijuana. A steering failure there would have been catastrophic. After Don Mauricio and his drivers left with the trailers, the Hernandez team began to close up the shop. There was a palpable sense of accomplishment in the air. Not only had they completed a large and complex job, but they had functioned as a true team. Roberto approached Javier as he was putting the last tools in his backpack. Javier, I have something else to offer you. One of my contacts, who owns a workshop in Zapopan, called me today. He's looking for a senior mechanic specializing in diesel. I told him about you. He wants to interview you on Monday. Javier was stunned. But what about here? You just offered me a job and that offer still stands. But it would be selfish of me not to tell you that there's a full-time opportunity at another shop. It's a decision you have to make. But I want you to know that I have contacts in this industry, and I'm going to recommend you to anyone looking for real talent. Javier's eyes welled up. Why would you do that? I'm helping you here. Because it's the right thing to do, Roberto replied simply. You're an excellent mechanic and you deserve a full opportunity. If the job in Zapopan is better for you and your family, take it. And if it doesn't work out, or if you'd rather work with me, the door will always be open. Javier held out his hand, but Roberto ignored it and hugged him instead. It was a hug between brothers, colleagues, men who understood the value of hard work and dignity. Thank you, Roberto, for believing in me when I was at my lowest point. You don't have to thank me for anything. Just promise me one thing. When you have your own stability, when you see another mechanic or worker in trouble, offer them a hand. That's how we build a better community. That night, Javier returned to his small apartment in a working-class neighborhood of Guadalajara with more money in his pocket than he had had in months, and more importantly, with renewed hope in his heart. Ana was waiting for him with dinner ready, eager to hear about his day. I got a job, Javier said, hugging her tightly. 2 fixed days, more projects, and there's a possibility of something permanent at another workshop. Things are looking up, love. Ana cried tears of relief and joy in his arms. The last few months had been a trial by fire for their marriage, but they had weathered it together. I always knew someone would recognize your talent, she whispered against his chest. You just needed the right opportunity. The following Monday, Javier went to the interview in Zapopan. The workshop owner, impressed by Roberto's recommendation and Javier's experience, offered him a permanent position with benefits. It was a solid, stable offer, exactly what Javier had been looking for months. But Javier made a surprising decision. He accepted the job in Zapopan, but negotiated to have Fridays off, days he would devote to working at Los Hernandez. It was his way of maintaining his connection to the place that had given him a second chance and continuing to learn from the team that had welcomed him. Roberto received the news with a genuine smile. He hadn't lost a valuable collaborator. He had gained a long-term ally in the industry and, more importantly, a friend. 3 months later, on a Friday afternoon, the Los Hernandez workshop was bustling with activity. Javier was working alongside Miguel on a complex electronic injection problem, sharing knowledge he had acquired in his new job. The workshop had experienced significant growth, thanks in part to referrals from satisfied customers and the team's improved reputation. Don Arturo Morales showed up driving his red Kenworth, the same truck that had brought Roberto and Javier together months earlier. He got out of the cab with a case of beer and a cake. "What's this, Don Arturo?" Roberto asked, confused. "It's the anniversary of when you fixed my truck," smiled the old trucker. "That day, you saved my business. Since then, I've gotten all my contracts back and gotten new ones. I wanted to thank you properly." The entire team gathered in the break room to celebrate. As they cut the cake and shared stories, Roberto raised his bottle in a toast to problems that seem impossible, to second chances, and to remembering that a person's true value is not measured when everything is going well, but when things get tough. "And for workshops that give opportunities when others close doors," added Javier, looking at Roberto with gratitude. The evening sun streamed through the workshop windows, bathing the space in golden light. Outside, Guadalajara continued its frenetic pace. But inside Los Hernandez, there was a moment of peace, of community, of satisfaction that comes from knowing that your work matters and that people matter more. Roberto watched his team, veterans, and new collaborators working together, sharing knowledge and laughter, and felt something he hadn't felt in years: complete confidence in the future of his workshop and gratitude for the unexpected twists and turns that life takes. Because sometimes the best solutions don't come from manuals or expensive spare parts, but from giving a chance to someone who is ready to prove their worth. And sometimes the most important engine you can fix is not that of a truck, but the spirit of a person who needs to believe in their own abilities again. Don Arturo's Kenworth truck would continue to travel the roads of Mexico for years, carrying goods and sustenance. But its most important contribution was not economic, but human. It was the catalyst that showed that in a world that often feels cold and indifferent, there is still room for compassion, for second chances, and for recognizing that true talent deserves to be valued regardless of the temporary circumstances surrounding it.